Hello, fluffy boys. Okay, a lot of people seem to believe that there are fabulous benefits to doing no reset runs in speedrunning. However, I think that, for most people under most conditions, no resets are a slow way to learn and improve, and that there are better approaches. However, undoubtedly, there are limited circumstances in which no resets can be really good, I need to admit before I get into my main argument. Firstly, if one lacks a more reasonable way to practice the late game, then one will need to play through the whole game over and over in order to remain sharp and well practiced at the late game. This is clearly not ideal, but for a lot of games there might not be any other choice. Secondly, if you're not going after a PB or some other predetermined goal time, but rather you're running in a different format entirely, then being good at no resets is likely going to help you. If you're doing a run for a marathon, the goal is to have fun and not embarrass yourself, not to PB. If you're doing a race, then your average time is a lot more important than your overall PB, and even if your run sucks, there's always the possibility that your opponent's run somehow sucks even worse. In either of those settings, you can't reset at all, so doing no resets in preparation is advisable so that you are comfortable with handling yourself in a no reset environment. On the other hand, if one's goal is to PB, or to bop somebody else, or to break some barrier or reach some milestone, then most people could probably achieve those goals faster with aggressive resetting. Ideally, what you want to do is separate practice sessions from attempt sessions and spend substantial amounts of time in practice. I will frequently do nothing but practice sessions for several days while I'm learning something. Then, once everything is solidified to my satisfaction, I will shorten my practice sessions to the first third to a half of each day's speedrunning time, and then dedicate the remaining speedrunning time to attempts. What exactly a practice session entails is obviously going to depend on the game and what kinds of practice tools are available. Karl Jobst has a really cool video about this, which is linked below. Practice should always include specific hard tricks and hard segments. Anything that you're still in the process of learning, and anything that you're not entirely comfortable with yet. Karl already emphasizes that focused practice on specific things every day is a good way of rapidly improving at the techniques used in the run. I think, however, that there is also a key benefit to highly granular practice of specific segments. Movement quality, or whatever equivalent the game has if movement quality does not apply. If you look very closely at a tiny part of the run and give it your full attention, often you can start to see micro-optimizations and scratch out little time saves out of nowhere. This is how one develops the ability to mysteriously gain time over one's competitors without needing to do anything noticeably different. One player who uses this to its full potential is F-Plush. He methodically looks over every little piece of a run and then grinds it into dust. It's quite impressive, really. You don't get that if you only practice by doing no resets. And of course, if you practice the late game a lot anyway, then you can reset as much as you want during attempts, and you'll still remain at full power and have a relatively even level of practice for the entire run. The first reason why no resets are not efficient for attempts is quite straightforward. If one spends time playing out runs that definitely are not the run, then it's going to take longer to get to the run. The second reason is that if you play out a run that's not entirely dead, but also not looking good, then somehow manage to salvage it and reach the goal anyway, the result will still be of worse quality than if the early game were good. For example, if you are plus 20 near the beginning, but bring it all the way back to end up minus 5, well, that's kind of cool. But how much cooler would it be if you had reset a few times to get a good start, been plus 0 near the beginning, then pulled off the same insane rest of the run and ended up minus 25 at the end? That would be awesome. Furthermore, because it's near the beginning of the run, the process of resetting and trying again takes a relatively short amount of time. The process of playing the first level a few more times until you don't screw it up too badly might take a lot less time out of your attempt session than even one single no reset run would. The third reason is that to have your name up in lights, number 1 on the leaderboard, you need the best single run ever. It doesn't matter what your average run looks like, only what your best run ever looks like. If one keeps doing attempts long enough, then one's PB eventually becomes very good for one's skill level. It gets close to the limit of what you could reasonably achieve, and very few runs are going to even get close to PB potential. At that point, it doesn't really matter quite as much what an ordinary run looks like, because an ordinary run would never be good enough anyway. That's not to say consistency isn't worthwhile. Even a tiny improvement in one's success rate at every little piece of a run amounts to a vast increase in the overall success rate. It does, however, mean that prioritizing no resets means to optimize one's average run, which is different from optimizing one's PB. I have a mathematical way of looking at this. You should reset if doing so improves your estimated probability of reaching your goal time per unit time. It can be stated like this. If the estimated probability of PBing before the game has started is greater than the probability of PBing given the conditions at the current moment, divided by the proportion of the run remaining, then it makes sense to reset. It should be noted that I am assuming that resetting in itself takes a negligible amount of time. If that is not the case, then an adjustment needs to be made, and that inequality becomes a bit more complicated, with the ultimate effect of being less reset heavy. Of course, those probabilities in the inequality aren't really knowable, and trying to come up with estimates by calculating them mid-run is probably a bad idea. However, back when I ran Celeste, there was one point where I tried to do that calculation. I threw in some wild assumptions about what the distribution of runs looks like, and did some maths based on that inequality, and the results told me that I should be resetting even more aggressively than I already was, although I admit those were clumsy back-of-envelope figures and they could be wrong. Ultimately, all this idea comes down to is, if resetting will make you more likely to PB sooner, then reset. The maths could be used to come up with an imaginary worst viable run. This worst viable run would have the same final time as your PB, or your goal time, but would always be behind it until it catches up at the very end. If you fall behind this imaginary run, then resetting means you are likely to PB sooner. This worst viable run will, generally, be close behind the PB at the beginning and end, but fall further behind the PB in the middle. This is because, near the beginning, a time loss might only cause a relatively small fall in the probability of PB, because there's heaps of the run to go. But that small fall will still be enough to cause a reset, because resetting and then getting back to where you were will take very little time. Near the end, on the other hand, even a small time loss could completely demolish the probability of PB, because there's not much of the run left to make up time, and you don't need to fall far behind for the run to completely die. Thus, in the middle of the run, there's more of a grey zone where a run might be kind of bad, but it might still make sense to keep going because there's still some hope to make up the time, and you've made it far enough that giving up the progress you've made kind of hurts. The Rixer contends in his video, First Levels in Speedrunning Suck, which is actually a pretty entertaining video and not that bad, I've linked it below, that there is no reason to treat a time loss or a risky trick near the beginning of a run as any different from an otherwise equal time loss or risky trick near the end of the run, even going so far as to call no resets the correct approach. Or, well, not really no resets, but just continuing runs with bad beginnings.
The correct approach can be solved with a simple question that you should ask yourself if you find yourself stuck in the early game. The 5 or 10 seconds that I lost in the early game could have just as easily been lost in the late game, right? Well, for categories over an hour, I think it's safe to say that people will keep the run going if they lose 5 seconds at the very end, but are quick to hit the reset button if those same 5 happen at the start. I know it can be difficult to keep your mindset positive when starting out behind, but fighting against that urge to reset is what I ultimately think leads to success. By treating every portion of the run as equal, you'll find the will in wanting to pull the run back and eventually PB.
Now, the reason why time losses at the beginning and end of the run can and should be treated differently is made very clear by my worst viable run principle. The two time losses differ in their effects on the probability of PBing. Near the beginning, the instinct of going for the risky trick and then resetting if you don't get it will probably prevail in the end. This is because you won't be far ahead, because you haven't had much opportunity to pull ahead yet, and it doesn't take much time loss to knock you behind the worst viable run. The same risky trick at the end, on the other hand, is a lot more interesting. If you're behind by a lot near the end, the run's probably dead, and you probably should have reset already. If you're behind by only a little bit near the end, then missing the risky trick might send the run from not great to completely dead, whereas hitting the trick and potentially pulling ahead could improve the probability of PB by a great deal. On the other hand, if you're a little bit ahead, then you definitely don't want to go for the hard trick, because you have a pretty good chance of PB without it, but the run could be completely ruined by failing the trick. Finally, if you're way ahead, then you'd probably still lean towards not attempting the trick, but it doesn't really matter as much anymore, because even if you miss the trick, you might still be ahead and still have a really high probability of PB anyway, so you might go for it if you were feeling up to it. So, don't feel bad about resetting all the time. That's probably your brain's way of trying to improve your chances of PBing as soon as possible. That's all I have to say. See you, Glossy Boy. Love you lot. Bye!